So I want to start with what I take to be still the sort of classic picture about what communicative success is. I'm going to call it the Lockean view. This is a quote from Locke's essay. It says, "To make words serviceable to the end of communication, it is necessary that they excite in the hearer exactly the same idea they stand for in the mind of the speaker. Without this, men fill one another's heads with noise and sounds, but convey not thereby their thoughts, and lay not before one another their ideas, which is the end of discourse and language." So I would put this picture on, I mean, not just in this passage, but in the entirety of book 3. Simply, it's supposed to be work like this. Suppose I have a thought, I'd like to share it with you. Then what I do is first I encode it as a sentence of a language. I assume we both speak. And then I utter this sentence when I think I have your attention. Then upon hearing me, you first identify the sentence I uttered. And then you use the reverse of my encoding to recover the thought I had. And so this is communication, and it's successful just in case you identify the thought I intended to convey. The Lockean view about communication is amended, and it's Paul Grice that is often credited with this amendment. So the idea is Locke is right in saying that successful communication requires that you figure out what I meant. That is the proposition I intended to convey. But Locke is mistaken in thinking that this is typically accomplished by simply identifying what I said, which is roughly the proposition I conventionally encoded. And so that these two things come apart in a variety of ways, but just quite often speakers don't mean more than what they say. And this is a phenomenon Grice was particularly interested in. And the prime example of meaning more than what one says is the case of conversational implicatures. And then there are also occasions when speakers don't mean what they say. So a straightforward example would be is when people are ironic or they speak in jest, then they don't mean what they say. Grice uses a language, he says they act as if, or they make as if they mean what they say, but they don't mean what they say. Okay, so that's an amendment to the view. And basically the amendment is that in order for communication to be successful, I really have to get to what I meant, and I use what you said as a means to figure out what it is that you meant, and communication again remains successful if I can identify what you meant. Now, so this is a little dialogue from the classic book by Harold Garfinkel's Studies in Ethnomethodology, which I want to use as a jumping board. So it's like a married couple watching TV, and they have this sort of casual conversation. I'm tired. Are you tired physically, mentally, or just bored? I don't know, I guess physically mainly. You mean that your muscles ache or your bones? I guess so. Don't be so technical. It's the first part. And there's more TV watching. And then we get this. All these old movies have the same kind of old iron bedstead in them. What do you mean? Do you mean all old movies, or some of them, or just the ones you have seen? What's the matter with you? You know what I mean. I wish you would be more specific. You know what I mean. Drop dead. Okay, it's a little extreme ending, but you can all picture that things can go downhill in a marriage this way. So what I'm interested here is, as you can see, there is, so the observation here is that A's utterances seem entirely reasonable, and B's requests for further specificity seem out of place. And so the question is, why is this so? what's wrong with, you know, acting like a philosopher, of, you know, asking more specific, what do you mean, be more specific, da, 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 da. So the hypothesis, I think a reasonable hypothesis when you look at this dialogue is that A has made it quite clear that he thinks that, that B knew what A meant. And information beyond that is not required for conversational felicity. So let's go back here. So here's the first complaint. You mean, so the first request for more specificity, you mean that your muscles ache or your bones, right? And this is in response to, you know, I'm tired or I'm physically tired. That's where we are at the here, right? Now, this is a case where arguably B knows what A said and acts like doesn't know what A meant. So that's fine. And A's response, you know, don't be so technical. Just the idea is you don't need that kind of specificity. Here, this is a more interesting case, right? So the A said, all these old movies have the same kind of old iron bedstead in them. And then the question is, what do you mean old movies, all of them, some of them? And this is a case where arguably B doesn't know what A said, right? Like all these old movies. It's not entirely clear what A is saying, what kind of, you know, what are the conditions under which what A is saying would be true is really unclear. And nonetheless, A responds, you know what I mean? And that response seems to be fine. Okay, so that's the observation here. So again, the second emphatic complaint seems reasonable, even though A did not provide enough information for B to find out what A said. And again, the hypothesis here is that felicity does not require that the hearer should know what the speaker said, provided she knows what the speaker meant, right? So that's a hypothesis that makes perfect sense of A's complaint. You know what I meant. Maybe you don't know what I said, but it doesn't matter. The success of communication rests on whether you know what I meant. And I have every reason to believe you know what I meant, so you have no right to request information about what I said. Sorry. So I take it that this is precisely what the Lockean view with the Gricean amendment I mentioned predicts, right? The view is really knowing what is said, what I said, is merely instrumental, because what matters for communication, in particular, what matters for communicative success, is that you should know what I meant. And if I have every reason to believe that you know what I meant, then it's neither here nor there, whether you know what I said. Okay. So I'm going to, I like this orthodox view, and we're going to talk a little bit about a phenomenon that kind of threatens it. So let's call cases when speaker's utterance is felicitous, even though she's not given enough information for the hearer to figure out what she said. So these would be cases of felicitous underspecification. This is a term, like felicity, that's a term that J.L. Austin introduced in general for community success of the highest sort. And so the idea is we have a felicitous utterance, but it's underspecified in the sense that you don't really know what the speaker said. So this is a term that Jeff King uses, and he claims, and I think he's right, that felicitous underspecification is all over the place. It's a normal conversational phenomenon. Here are a couple of examples. So you just say, I've been to Paris. Now the tense here is unspecific. So it is, it is not plausible that what you said here is that at any time in the past you've been to Paris. People, when you use the past tense, normally talk about some contextually given past interval. That's when this is supposed to be taking place. And if I tell you, oh, I left the stove open as we leave the house, I don't mean that that happened, 15 years ago or something like that. But here, I can just say I've been to Paris, and it's unspecified exactly when that was supposed to be. Maggie's tall. Well, how tall? Maybe in order to be clear what I said, there would have to be some kind of comparison class or standard of tallness that's given. But things like this, Maggie's tall, are perfectly fine, even when that's not ensured. Possessives, my boots fit well, right? I mean, what's this relation that the possessive marker is supposed to indicate? Am I supposed to own these boots, or maybe I just borrowed them? You can even envision a case where people are just looking at a boot and you hope to buy this, and those are my boots. Anyway, so that doesn't seem to be specific, and that often doesn't stand in the way of communicating successfully with these. When you arrive, I'll be ready. What exactly will you be ready for? To go with you, to get in the car, to, even if you have a specific plan, it looks like there are multiple candidates for what it is that I'm ready for, that I might be saying here. So in all of these cases, I think one can legitimately say that it's not clear exactly what I said, but that doesn't stand in the way of me meaning something, which is what communicative success requires. So again, I think it's a very interesting empirical question that pragmatic studies of what exactly the speaker means in making these utterances in various contexts. And it's also very interesting how the hearer knows what she means. Obviously, typically the hearer relies on semantic information that's encoded in the words, but goes way beyond them. So what's clear is that she means something and can convey it to the hearer without a glitch in many, many cases. So that's felicitous underspecification. There is no problem with felicitous underspecification conceptually if you are Lockean, with or without the Gricean amendment. This is as things should be. It doesn't matter. Saying something is a means by which you can mean things, and it's dispensable in certain cases. So these seem to be those. Okay. So the problem really is that there is a limit to felicitous underspecification. And so here, consider this particular dialogue. So aren't these two girls the same height? And then B responds, she's taller than she. You can do this also with like, aren't these two trees the same height? And you respond, that is taller than that, without making any kind of demonstrative gesture or anything. So these really sound infelicitous. It's very bad to say something like this. But that's a puzzle. So arguably in a setting where there is a straight question, A knows what B means by these kinds of answers, because the answer provides this is a complete answer to the question under discussion. Like, if I say she's taller than she, then clearly the girls are not the same height. And that's a complete answer to the question that was raised. And so that's what I meant. presumably, if I'm a cooperative speaker, there was a question asked, I have answered it. So the problem is really what's wrong with this? Why is this answer infelicitous from the perspective of the sort of Lockean view? So I'll call this the problem. So the problem really is that there are cases where I make an utterance which is clearly sufficient to provide a question, an answer to the question on the table, and it should be perfectly satisfactory in the conversational setting, but it really isn't felicitous. Why is that? So then you go back to sort of standard textbook that's used these days to teach semantics and a little bit of pragmatics in linguistics departments and some philosophy departments where people want to learn these things. That's Irena Hyman, Angelika Kratzer's Semantics in Generative Grammar. And they use, I picked the example because they use the example. And so there you see, if you utter a sentence like she's taller than she, then your utterance is felicitous only if the utterance situation provides values for the two occurrences of the pronoun she. Right, so they give a rule like this. And the general rule they propose is roughly that that the context must settle the reference of unbound pronouns, which in this case would be these personal pronouns, like the two occurrences of she, in felicitously used sentences. So context somehow has to provide a value, must have, now in this case, it would be a referent, right? It would have to be a reference. So somehow the speaker then would have to do something to make the context such that you can figure out what these two occurrences of the pronoun she refer to in order to speak felicitously. This accounts for a problem. So if you have a rule like that, then no problem. It was unfelicitous because this rule was violated by in the example I used. There's a problem with this proposal. So consider this sort of case. Package. Your partner comes home, sees a large package on the front next to the entrance door. You point in that direction, and then you say, "This arrived today." Perfectly felicitous utterance, despite the fact that context does not settle whether the demonstrative picks out the package itself or what's in it, the content of the package, right? And this should be infelicitous according to this Hyman-Kratzer rule, right? Because context just doesn't tell you whether what you're demonstrating is the package or its content. And nonetheless, this is a perfectly felicitous utterance, right? This is a case of felicitous underspecification. But then if you have a rule like Hyman-Kratzer's rule, then all of these cases are a problem for you. So then there is a different kind of approach of how to deal with this case. This is from Imogen Dickey's paper, Understanding Singular Terms. She says, when I listen to what you say, I'm trying to achieve cognitive focus on you as another subject of consciousness and to join you in relations of shared cognitive focus with things in the world. So basically, the idea is that Imogen proposes a rule according to which the utterance of a sentence is not felicitous unless the speaker provides enough information for the hearer to achieve this kind of shared cognitive focus with her on the object that she's talking about, right? So that doesn't happen in the case when I answer the question whether all the girls are the same height, saying she is taller than she, because I have not done enough to ensure that we share cognitive focus on the girls I'm talking about. So, normally cognitive focus is achieved whenever the speaker calls attention to some candidate objects and what she says failed to discriminate among the candidate objects. right? So this would account for the package case, right? The idea is that we have a shared cognitive focus. So I can just say this arrived today because I called attention to these candidate objects, the package itself and its content, using my demonstration. And what I say doesn't discriminate about them. I mean, they presumably came together. There is absolutely no reason to distinguish them. What I say doesn't distinguish them. It's either true of both or of neither. So that's fine. And that would be a case of cognitive focus. Even though there are two objects, we can share cognitive focus. We can, to use this metaphor, create a mental file that applies to both of them. And that's the criterion of cognitive success. That's one of the desiderata of cognitive success for imaging. So this accounts for both the problem case and for the package example. But now just consider when you have two packages, right? So your spouse comes home, sees two large packages on the floor. They are next to each other. In my case, they're on top of each other. It doesn't matter. You point in that direction and say, this arrived today. So, right, all four candidates are lumped together when it comes to being delivered today, which is, or arrived today, which is what I say. So either all of them are or none of them is. In principle, you could imagine that they didn't come together, but there is no indication or no reason to assume. So this is a case where Dickey's rule would predict that we get felicity, but we don't. If you say this arrived today, it's not felicitous if there are two packages on top of each other or next to each other or something like that. There's also another interesting phenomenon. So, proper names also give rise to infelicity, but they're markedly better than pronouns. So if you compare this, aren't these two girls the same height? And I say she's taller than she, that's really bad. If I say Lucy's taller than Sue, that is better, even if you don't know which is Lucy and which is Sue, right? Even if you don't know the names of these girls, if I say Lucy's taller than Sue, you're gonna give me a pass. I put a question mark there. I'm not saying that this is perfect, but I just wanna highlight the contrast. It's much better than she's taller than she. And neither the Heimkreutzer nor the Dickey rule or approach would predict this kind of graded evaluations in these cases. Moreover, if pressed about what B said, A would say something like this. B said that some girl is taller than another, or some girl named Lucy is taller than some girl named Sue. So again, what's interesting, not only is it the case that A knows what B meant, that B successfully answered the question on the table, but would even be willing to make a claim about what B said, which claim is tricky because it seems to sort of fill in the non-specificity by just basically quantifying over it or something like that. Okay. Okay. So this is it. We have a problem here. So I want to step back and see how the problem really arises in a kind of Gricean setting. So if you have a theory of conversation, then what it should do is it should tell you what the norms of conversation are. That's like one or maybe the main thing we want from a theory of conversation is that it gives us some kind of comprehensive account of what norms are at play when we are talking to each other. Now, according to Grice, there is a fundamental norm in conversation, and that is cooperativity. I like to state This is a reworked version of Grice's principle, which brings in knowledge, which he doesn't, but I like to bring it in. So the fundamental norm here is supposed to be that if you are a speaker, you are supposed to make sure that you make it shared knowledge how a particular utterance you make contributes to the goal of the conversation. That's what you have to do. If you don't do that, then you violate the fundamental norm of conversation, which is cooperativity. You are not conversationally cooperative if you violate this. Now, I just want to, there's a huge methodological issue. So a lot of contemporary philosophy of language that focuses on conversations and pragmatic matters focuses on non-cooperative speech. And there's always like a long criticism of Grice that, you know, he's very naive, that he thinks conversation is cooperative, but he lived before the time of Trump and didn't realize that there is all these like really propagandistic and non-cooperative speech. So I think that's not quite right. So I think that the idea is simply that cooperative speech is explanatorily prior to non-cooperative speech. So if you have a theory of cooperative speech, and then you need like a general theory of pretense in behavior, including speech, and some general theory of coercion in social settings. And if you add that to your theory of cooperative speech, then you can explain instances of non-cooperative speech. At least that's sort of the kind of methodology that I like. And so I will assume that something like cooperativity is a fundamental norm. Of course, it is a norm that is violated sometimes, but those cases are best explained by taking it for granted that that is a fundamental norm of conversation, and then in some cases you go against it. Yeah, but then there is this thing, the goal of conversation. What's that? Like, what could that possibly be, the goal of conversation? So if you go back to Locke, he does talk about the goal of speech. And he said the goal of speech is to lay our ideas in front of another. That's my goal. So my goal is to disclose to you some of what is in my head. That's what my, that's the goal of speech. Now, I think that's wrong. It might be that that's the goal of the speaker, but if you are a Gricean, then you think speech is fundamentally governed by the norm of cooperativity, and so the goal of speech is going to be some norm that speakers and hearers share. So Grice basically says, I know there's lots of kinds of goals conversations can have, but again, I take one to be fairly general and perhaps explanatorily prior, and that is what I call shared knowledge. So the goal of conversation is to share private knowledge pertaining to a topic of shared concern. This is our shared knowledge, right? Certainly in the simple cases, certainly in the cases that seem close to animal communication, this seems to be what the goal is. That I know something and we want to make what I know shared knowledge. And what I know is of shared concern, not something utterly irrelevant to you. Again, so the idea is even if the parties are ultimately interested in something else, could be anything, coordinate joint action, get better acquainted, simply avoid boredom, all these things that you might get into a conversation. These goals are usually achieved, at least in part, by means of sharing some private knowledge. That's the idea. Okay. So let's get back with this sort of more explicitly Gricean framework to what the problem is with our problem case, right? So in this case, it looks like B is cooperative in sharing his knowledge, right? B informs A that the girls or trees are not the same height, right? That's what cooperativity requires. That's the shared concern was, let's assume, given by the question that was asked, you know, so I'm fully cooperative. The answer is nonetheless infelicitous. So then we have two options. We can either say that the aim of this particular conversation is something more than sharing knowledge, and that's why you get infelicity, because this other aim is not achieved, or there is some further norm besides cooperativity at play. I don't want to do anything besides, you know, providing as good an answer as my private knowledge allows me to your question, but there is some other norm that I have to obey, and I don't, and so you get infelicity. Those are the two options, really, if you're Gricean. So Viki opts for the first. So she thinks conversation aims not only at shared knowledge, but also at shared focus on objects. So that's a big radical revision of the Gricean view. You just add an entirely new goal. You say it's not enough for communicative success to share knowledge on some topic that's of shared concern, but we need this other thing of sort of sharing focus on things in the world. Hyman and Kreutzer, they don't say that conversation has to have some other aim here, but they think that we need another norm, and in fact, they think they need a norm that has nothing to do with the dynamics of conversation. It's like a purely linguistic norm. It's just like, if you use the pronoun, you got to have a referent identified. If you didn't do your job, that's infelicitous, irrespective of what your aims are, why you are doing this thing, and so on. So I'm kind of unhappy with either of these approaches. I think Hyman Kreutzer is right. What we have here is a missing norm, not some alternative goal. But I would hope that the norm could be something that we can tie to the pragmatics, to the plans and goals of the participants in a conversation. So Grice actually has this example where he talks about specificity, answers that are less specific than required, right? This is an example that he uses from Logic and Conversation. A asks, where does C live? And B says, somewhere in the south of France. And what Grice says about the example is that B's answer is less specific than required to meet A's needs. And that's presumably because A doesn't have the required information. So we get a conversational implicature in this case that B doesn't know exactly where C lives. And you derive this conversational implicature from this reasoning about, okay, so, you know, A wants this information, B is less specific than what seems to be required. Why is A being less specific? It's because presumably if B is still cooperative, that's presumably because B doesn't have enough evidence to be more specific, and so then B doesn't know. Okay, that's how a conversational implicature is supposed to arise, out of less specificity. Now, what about this? Where does C live? In Avignon. He moved there 3 months ago. So here, B's answer is more specific than required to meet A's needs. A didn't ask, you know, when C moved there. But nonetheless, B provides this information. And we can, again, use this sort of Gricean machinery that presumably presumably B is cooperative. That's presumably because B thinks A would welcome this information, that this would be something useful or good for A. So again, we have excess specificity, and this also gives rise to conversational implicature, a different kind of conversational implicature. That's not something that Grice mentions, but it's the same idea. So what's going on here? So, right, we constantly think about why others do what they do. And when their actions fail to conform to what we take their goals to be, we seek some kind of explanation. Now, I think this is not a feature of conversation. This is the general feature of social cognition. We take each other to be rational agents, and whenever we observe that somebody isn't doing what we assume is their goal, then we seek some kind of explanation. So conversational implicatures arise from this kind of reasoning, and they operate under the presumption that the participants aim at sharing knowledge on a topic of shared concern. So, right. So then the question is again, assuming the question asked by A identifies the shared concern, there doesn't seem to be any problem with lack of specificity or excess specificity, right? So it's not clear what triggers this conversational implicature on reflection. Like, you asked me this question, and I provide you with some information. Why does it matter that it's less or more than what would be ideal or something like this? So what Grice does, if you read the text, is that he doesn't actually identify the goal of conversation in the kind of austere way that I did, but builds efficiency in it. So he thinks what your goal is to share knowledge maximally efficiently. That's your goal. Now, if you assume that it's our goal when we talk to each other to maximally efficiently sharing knowledge on some topic of shared concern, then it will follow that a cooperative speaker should provide as full an answer to a question on the table as possible, as it's permitted by whatever knowledge they have, and should not provide more information, should not provide more than a full answer, even if your knowledge permits, because it wouldn't be maximally efficient. So that's how Grice solves this problem, but I think that's a mistake. So I think it's just simply a mistake to think that efficiency is a goal of conversation, that being maximally efficient is something that we aim at in conversation. I think efficiency is a rational constraint on how any goal is to be achieved. So it's a norm, and it's a norm distinct from cooperativity, because it's not specific to conversation or even social cognition. It's a fully general norm of rationality. Something like choose the optimal means to achieve your goal. Nothing to do with conversation. Doesn't belong in a theory that's specifically about conversation. It's just something that you can take from your general theory of rationality. Good, so now we have separated this. Now, what happens when you're too efficient? So consider these cases. You run into a friend on the street. It's common knowledge that he has a new place, and you have a car, he doesn't have a car. And so he just asks you a favor. Could you help me move out of my apartment tomorrow? And you say, sorry, I can't. Did you see this new movie with Frances McDormand? Or you say, sure I can. Did you see this new movie with Frances McDormand? So I take it that these continuations are simply infelicitous. Moving to a new topic answer after answering the question in this way is infelicitous. Now, Grice would say it's not polite, you're being rude, or something like that. And that's a kind of infelicity that he thinks he doesn't have to worry about. In the general theory of conversation, politeness is a whole separate issue. I'm not sure that this is a matter of politeness. And I certainly don't think that there's a principled reason to treat these cases differently. Your friend will really be puzzled of what's going on. And it's not clear that you're being impolite. I mean, even if you say, sorry, I feel so bad, I can't. That settles the question. It also makes you polite. And you still can't move on quite like this. It feels like you owe some kind of reason to your friend or something. So I think the source of infelicity in this case is excess efficiency. You are too efficient. You just took the best and easiest and most efficient way to share knowledge on this shared concern and called it a day, and you can't. So to account for this, we would need an appeal to another norm here, besides efficiency and cooperativity or anything like this, because this seems fine in that line. So what I propose is that we have an opposing norm to efficiency, which I call intelligibility. So in a conversation, you're supposed to make yourself intelligible. And I take this to be a requirement that demands more of you than make sure that your utterances are understood, that your conversational partner can figure out what you meant. That one would follow from cooperativity. It's really that you should make yourself understood, at least to some extent, not just your utterance, the particular act that you are performing. So you need to make public some of your thinking behind the utterances that you're making. And so that includes some of your private reasons for making the utterances and also some of your private plans that you seek to realize by making these utterances. And if you don't do that, as is the case here, then you are going to undermine your partner's trust that you're still sharing the goal of conversation. So this is the norm as I see it. And sure enough, about your thinking behind your utterances are shared knowledge to sustain trust in the conversation. Now, so this norm, the norm of efficiency, which is a pure rational norm, has nothing to do with conversation. The norm of intelligibility, which has something to do with conversation, although perhaps it's a sort of broader social cognition level norm, they're in conflict, right? And so then what happens is that you have to balance. Intelligibility is, making yourself intelligible is like an imperfect duty. It's like you don't have to disclose in a conversation what exactly you're up to, what your reasons are for saying what you're saying, or what your plans are with making the utterances. But you have to give some information about that. And if you don't, and you know, to the extent that you have to do that, you have to be less than fully efficient, because this is excess information. This is not information that's required for the goal of conversation. So I think there is a kind of delicate issue of sort of playing out efficiency and intelligibility in conversation. And so that might make the landscape here interesting. Back to the problem. I think this is what is going to explain the limits of felicitous underspecification. So B's utterance here, when, you know, are these two girls the same height? And you say she's taller than she. So I take it that B's utterance really does provide a full answer to his question, but it's inefficient. It's inefficient because B could simply have said no, they're not the same height. That would have been fine. So if you give an inefficient answer, this raises the question of why you chose this inefficient route. But it turns out that the information that you convey in this inefficient way does not go beyond what you could have conveyed with the more efficient answer. Saying she's taller than she without indicating who you're talking about, conveys exactly the same information as saying no. That's it. So then this makes the utterance unintelligible. So we have no way of figuring out why you would have done this, and that makes it unintelligible. It violates the norm of intelligibility, which is what I suggest will give rise to infelicity. So this is the explanation. There is a new norm. There's no fiddling with what the goal of conversation is. There's no purely linguistic demand on you or anything like this. It's all tied up with the broad theory of conversation. Consider the modifications. Suppose you say, now consider imagine A is blind. And ask the question, aren't these two girls the same height? And you say she's taller than she. I take it that this improves the felicity of B's utterance. A can infer from the answer, plus some background knowledge, that, I completely mixed up the letters here, that B probably has visual evidence for the answer. And this makes the utterance intelligible, right? So, you know, if I don't know what your reason is for thinking or what your evidence is for saying that the two girls aren't the same height, certainly if you say she's taller than she, that's going to be an indication that you probably see one, see the other, and make this comparison. And especially if I can't do that, so then that explains why you are not making an effort to identify them. So it improves, which I think is exactly right. And the same thing happens with proper names or with complex demonstratives. So if I say Jill is taller than Rachel, or that blonde girl is taller than that girl in the blue sweater, that improves makes it more felicitous. And I take it that that's because the excess information, even though it's not immediately relevant, I can assume that this is something that you plan to build on later on. So I give you a pass. I'm thinking about why you might have said Jill is taller than Rachel. Well, maybe later on, you're gonna tell me more about this girl, Jill and Rachel, how you know them or whatever. So introduce these labels for later use. That makes sense. That's not gonna arise with the she and she. Those are not going to be helpful in this way. So it's predicted that you get improved felicity with proper names or complex demonstrative. And in fact, the more information I'm going to give you, the longer these complex demonstratives get, the more acceptable my response is going to be. So I think that's a good thing that this theory can explain on the empirical side. And it also explains what's going on in the packages case, right? When you point in the direction of the two packages, say this arrived today, you convey the information that all four candidate objects, the two packages and their contents, arrived today, but you did so inefficiently. Even if your partner knows what you meant, she might not have. She might have thought that you mean one or the other of the two packages and their contents. There's a risk here. And you can avoid the risk by simply using the plural, which is certainly not a big, difficulty. These arrived today, and you didn't do that. And so the fact that you didn't do that makes this thing unintelligible. Okay, summary. So there is an interest, sort of a growing interest in felicitous underspecification. So the first claim I wanted to defend is that this interest is misplaced. Those of us who hold on to the sort of traditional Lockean view with its Gricean amendment, we correctly predict that felicitous underspecification is all over the place. It's not something that needs a special explanation, even though the mechanism whereby speakers can identify what the speaker means in this case is something that should be studied, but there's no conceptual challenge to the general picture of communication. The problem really is the reverse, that unbound pronouns give rise to infelicitous underspecification. And I also claim that current explanations of this phenomenon are empirically weak and that they're conceptually disrupted. They change too much of the orthodox framework without sufficient motivation. Then I observed that the orthodox Gricean account of specificity implicatures rests on the norm of efficiency, and argued that the account needs to acknowledge some norm that opposes the norm of efficiency. I called this norm intelligibility, which is the requirement to make enough about one's thinking behind one's utterances, shared knowledge to sustain trust. And I showed how examples of infelicitous underspecification can be accounted for by appeal to these two norms. So that's all. Thank you.